The horse stopped in front of her Diti, like it remembered her. The Montana morning stretched endless and grey before Ilara Mackenzie as she pulled her worn hiking boots over thick wool socks. Through the kitchen window of her small cabin, the Bitterroot Mountains stood like silent sentinels against the pale sky, their peaks shrouded in the kind of mist that seemed to swallow sound itself. She had chosen this isolated corner of Ravalli County precisely for its emptiness, a place where her grief could echo without disturbing anyone else's peace. 5 years had passed since the accident on Highway 93, but time had done little to soften the jagged edges of her loss. The head-on collision with a drunk driver had taken everything in a single terrible moment. Her parents, David and Margaret Mackenzie, had been driving to pick her up from college for Thanksgiving break. In the trailer behind their truck, Shadow, her chestnut gelding with the distinctive white star on his forehead, had been waiting to surprise her with a homecoming ride through their family's ranch. Ilara wrapped her fingers around the cold coffee mug, feeling the ceramic's rough texture against her palms. The cabin felt smaller each morning, its log walls pressing in with the weight of memories she couldn't escape. Photos of her family lined the mantelpiece, but she had removed every image of Shadow months ago. Some losses, she had discovered, were too raw to look at directly. Her job at the Missoula Public Library had become her only connection to the outside world, a necessary routine that got her through the weeks. She catalogued books, helped patrons find forgotten stories, and returned each evening to this sanctuary of solitude. Her colleagues had stopped inviting her to social gatherings long ago, understanding that Ilara preferred the company of silence to small talk that felt like walking on glass. The hiking trail behind her cabin wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, eventually opening onto high meadows where wildflowers bloomed in brief, brilliant summers. She had walked this path countless times, seeking something she couldn't name in the rhythm of her footsteps against packed earth. Today felt no different as she stepped outside, the October air sharp enough to make her breath visible in small puffs. The forest welcomed her with its familiar hush. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered against dead bark, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or chipmunk provided gentle percussion to her measured pace. These sounds had become her meditation, a natural symphony that asked nothing of her except presence. As she climbed higher, the trees began to thin, revealing glimpses of the valley below where the Bitterroot River wound like a silver ribbon through autumn gold cottonwoods. The sight should have brought peace, but lately, even beauty felt like an accusation. How could the world continue being magnificent when her heart remained so thoroughly broken? Ilara paused at a familiar boulder, smooth granite, worn by countless seasons of weather. She often stopped here to catch her breath and look back at the distance she had covered. The cabin appeared as a tiny square of warmth far below, smoke rising from its chimney in a straight line before the mountain breeze caught and scattered it. A sound reached her then, carried on the wind, unexpected and haunting, the thunder of hooves against earth, rhythmic and powerful, growing closer. She turned toward the sound, her pulse quickening with a mixture of curiosity and inexplicable dread. Wild horses weren't uncommon in this part of Montana, descendants of ranch stock that had found freedom in these mountains decades ago. They appeared suddenly over a rise, a band of perhaps 20 horses moving with the fluid grace of creatures born to run. Bays, blacks, pintos, and greys flowed across the meadow like water finding its course, their manes streaming behind them in the crisp morning air. Ilara pressed herself against the boulder, not wanting to startle them, content to witness this display of wild freedom. But, as the herd passed, one horse separated from the group. A chestnut gelding, his coat gleaming copper in the filtered sunlight, slowed his gallop to a canter, then to a walk. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as details became clear. The proud arch of his neck, the intelligent set of his ears, and there, centered on his forehead like a beacon, a perfect white star. The resemblance was impossible, devastating, complete. Every rational part of her mind insisted this was coincidence, that grief was playing cruel tricks with her perception. But her heart recognized something deeper, something that transcended logic and spoke directly to the part of her that had never stopped believing in miracles. The horse stopped 20 feet away, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her knees weak. The rest of the herd continued their journey, disappearing over another ridge, but this one remained. He took a step forward, then another, his movements careful and deliberate, as if approaching something precious and fragile. The wind died to nothing as the chestnut horse moved closer, each step deliberate and measured, his hooves making soft impressions in the meadow grass, still wet with morning dew. Ilara remained frozen against the boulder, her heart hammering so violently she was certain he could hear it. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, that horses didn't return from the dead, that grief was simply painting familiar features onto a stranger's face. But as he drew nearer, details emerged that made her blood run cold with recognition. The slight scar above his left hock, white and thin like a crescent moon, exactly where Shadow had cut himself on a fence post when he was 3 years old. The way his left ear twitched twice before settling forward, a nervous habit that had always preceded his request for carrots. Most unnervingly, the measured cadence of his approach, as if he understood that sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile magic was unfolding between them. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The words came automatically, the same gentle tone she had used with Shadow 1,000 times before. The horse's ears pricked forward at the sound, and he nickered softly, a low rumble that vibrated through the morning air like a question being asked. Ilara's hands trembled as she slowly extended one palm, the way her father had taught her when she was 8 years old, and Shadow was just a yearling on their family ranch. "Let them come to you," David Mackenzie had said, his weathered hands guiding her small ones. "Trust is earned in inches, never forced." The memory of her father's voice was so vivid it nearly brought her to her knees. The horse stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, they studied each other across the small distance that separated them. His eyes were deep brown, almost black, flecked with gold, in a pattern she remembered tracing with her finger during long summer afternoons in the pasture. Those eyes held intelligence, yes, but also something else. A sadness that seemed to mirror her own, as if he too had been carrying a burden these past 5 years. When his muzzle finally touched her palm, warm and soft and impossibly familiar, Ilara felt something inside her chest crack open like a dam under pressure. Tears she had held back for months came in a flood, hot and unstoppable, streaming down her cheeks as she pressed her forehead against his neck. His coat smelled of pine needles and wild grass, of freedom and open spaces, but underneath it all was something else, something that reminded her of home. "Shadow," she breathed against his neck, the name torn from her throat like a prayer. "Is it really you?" The horse stood perfectly still, allowing her to cry against him as if he understood that this moment was sacred, that her tears were washing away 5 years of carefully constructed walls. His breathing was steady and calm, a rhythm that gradually synchronized with her own until they stood together in the mountain meadow like two pieces of a puzzle, finally finding their fit. From her pocket, Ilara pulled a protein bar, breaking off small pieces and offering them on her flattened palm. He ate carefully, his lips gentle against her skin, and she noticed the way he chewed, thoughtful and unhurried, exactly the way Shadow had always eaten treats. This couldn't be coincidence. Every instinct she possessed insisted this was more than a case of mistaken identity, more than wishful thinking painting familiar features onto a wild horse's face. As if sensing her doubt, the horse stepped back and fixed her with a long, steady look. Then, in a movement that stopped her breath entirely, he bowed his head and pawed the ground 3 times with his right front hoof. It was Shadow's old trick, the one she had taught him using patience and apple slices during long summer afternoons when she was 15. The gesture was so specific, so perfectly executed, that any remaining skepticism crumbled away like ancient paper. "Oh my God," she whispered, reaching out to touch the white star on his forehead. "Oh my God, it is you!" The horse nickered again, softer this time, and stepped closer until she could feel his warmth against her legs. He was taller than she remembered, more muscled from years of mountain living, but the essence of him remained unchanged. The way he held his head, the pattern of his breathing, the gentle pressure of his muzzle against her shoulder, all of it was exactly as it had been in the life they had shared before the world went dark. Behind them, the mountain wind picked up, setting the aspens to trembling with a sound like distant applause. The morning light was growing stronger, burning away the mist and revealing the full sweep of the valley below. Somewhere in that vastness lay the remnants of her old life, the ranch that had been sold to pay medical bills and funeral expenses, the dreams that had died alongside her family on a stretch of highway she could never bring herself to drive again. But here, in this moment suspended between disbelief and wonder, those losses felt less final somehow. Shadow nuzzled her cheek, his breath warm against her skin, and for the first time in 5 years, Ilara felt something other than emptiness in her chest. It was small and fragile, this feeling, like a candle flame in a drafty room, but it was unmistakably hope. "I don't understand how this is possible," she murmured, running her hands along his neck, feeling the solid reality of muscle and bone beneath her fingers. "But I don't care. I don't care about impossible." The horse seemed to understand, pressing closer until she could wrap her arms around his neck properly, holding him the way she had dreamed of holding him again through countless sleepless nights. In the distance, she could hear the faint calls of his herd, wild and free, but he showed no inclination to follow. Instead, he stood with her as the sun climbed higher, painting the meadow in shades of gold and amber, two souls who had found each other again against all odds and reason. The sun had climbed higher by the time Ilara finally stepped back from Shadow, her face still damp with tears, but her breathing steadier than it had been in years. The horse watched her with those impossibly familiar eyes, patient and calm, as if he had been waiting 5 years for this exact moment, and could wait 5 more if necessary. The rest of his herd had long since disappeared over the far ridge, but he showed no signs of following, no restless shifting or anxious calls toward their retreating forms. "You should go with them," Ilara said softly, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "You belong with them now. You're free." Shadow's response was to lower his head and nuzzle her jacket pocket, the same pocket where she used to keep peppermints during their rides around the family ranch. The gesture was so achingly familiar that fresh tears threatened to spill over. Without thinking, she reached into her backpack and found the emergency energy bar she always carried, breaking it into small pieces and offering them on her palm. As he ate, she studied him more carefully in the growing light. His coat was thicker now, adapted to harsh mountain winters, and his hooves were harder, shaped by years of rocky terrain. Scars from brambles and rough living marked his legs and flanks, testament to a survivor's journey through the wilderness. Yet beneath these changes, the essence of the horse she had loved remained unchanged, as if some core part of him had been waiting, preserved and protected for this reunion. "I used to dream about you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every night for the first 2 years. I'd wake up expecting to hear you in the pasture, that soft nickering you'd make when you wanted breakfast." Shadow's ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice, and he stepped closer until his chest nearly touched her shoulder. "The dreams stopped eventually. I made them stop. It hurt too much to keep hoping." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge being built 1 word at a time. For 5 years, Ilara had perfected the art of not hoping, of expecting nothing from life except the basic necessity of getting through each day. She had trained herself to find safety in emotional numbness, to prefer the predictable ache of grief over the dangerous possibility of joy. But here was Shadow, solid and warm and impossibly real, challenging every defense mechanism she had carefully constructed. His presence demanded something she had forgotten how to give: faith in outcomes she couldn't control, belief in connections that transcended logic, trust in the idea that love might be stronger than loss. "I work at the library now," she continued, running her fingers through his mane. "In Missoula, it's quiet there, safe. I help people find books, and then I come home to my cabin and read until I fall asleep. It's not much of a life, but it's—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Manageable." Shadow shifted his weight, pressing his shoulder against hers with gentle but insistent pressure. The movement was so reminiscent of the way he used to ask for attention during grooming sessions that she laughed despite herself, a rusty sound that surprised them both. It had been so long since she had laughed that she had almost forgotten the physical mechanics of it, the way it bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest and spilled out like water from a spring. "You always were pushy," she said, and this time the laugh came easier. "Remember when you figured out how to open the gate latch? Dad had to put 3 different locks on that gate before you finally admitted defeat." The horse nickered in response, a sound so perfectly timed it seemed like acknowledgement, like he was saying, "Of course I remember. I remember everything." And perhaps he did. Perhaps memory worked differently for horses, less complicated by doubt and self-protection, more pure and immediate and true. As if reading her thoughts, Shadow turned and began walking slowly toward a cluster of aspen trees at the meadow's edge, looking back at her with unmistakable invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Elara followed, her boots squelching slightly in the damp grass. The aspens were in full autumn glory, their leaves trembling like golden coins in the slight breeze, and beneath them lay a carpet of fallen color that crunched softly underfoot. Shadow led her to a fallen log, weathered smooth by years of mountain weather, and stood beside it with his side toward her. The invitation was clear, and terror shot through Elara's veins like ice water. She hadn't been on a horse since the accident, hadn't even been able to look at photographs of horses without feeling nauseated with grief and guilt. "I can't," she whispered, backing away a step. "I haven't ridden in 5 years. I don't even know if I remember how." But Shadow remained patient, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He didn't move away or show any signs of leaving. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, settling into a relaxed stance that suggested he could wait as long as necessary for her to find her courage. The sun climbed higher overhead, warming the air and filling the meadow with the kind of golden light that photographers chase and poets try to capture in words. Birds called from the surrounding trees, their songs weaving together into a symphony of life continuing, seasons turning, time moving forward whether hearts were ready or not. Finally, with hands that shook like leaves in a storm, Elara approached the log. Shadow stood perfectly still as she climbed onto it, her movements clumsy with fear and disuse. When she finally swung her leg over his back, settling onto his broad, warm back without saddle or bridle, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elara sat frozen, overwhelmed by the familiar sensation of being astride a horse, by the living warmth beneath her, and the feeling of coming home to a place she thought no longer existed. Shadow's breathing was steady beneath her, his muscles relaxed and ready, waiting for her signal. When she finally squeezed her legs gently against his sides, he began to walk with the same careful, measured pace he had always used when he sensed uncertainty in his rider. They moved through the dappled light beneath the aspens, and with each step, something inside Elara began to unlock, like a door that had been sealed for far too long, finally remembering how to open. Shadow carried Elara through the aspen grove with the gentle precision of a horse who understood that his rider was made of spun glass and old wounds. Each step was carefully placed, his gait smooth as silk, as if he sensed that sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile miracle had brought them together again. The golden leaves above them caught the morning light and scattered it in dancing patterns across his neck, and Elara found herself mesmerized by the play of shadow and sun across his familiar coat. As they emerged from the trees onto a wider meadow, the full scope of the Montana wilderness spread before them like a living painting. The Bitterroot Range stretched endlessly in both directions, its peaks touched with early snow that gleamed white against the deep blue sky. Below them, the valley floor was a patchwork of ranches and forests, bisected by the silver thread of the river that had carved this landscape over millennia. "I used to dream of riding like this again," Elara admitted, her voice stronger now, carried away by the wind that swept down from the peaks. "But I convinced myself it would never happen, that some things once lost stay lost forever." Shadow's ears flicked back at the sound of her voice, acknowledging her words without breaking his steady rhythm. They had always communicated this way, through touch and tone and the subtle language of trust that exists between horse and rider. It was a conversation that bypassed words entirely, speaking directly to something deeper and more essential than conscious thought. As they crested a small hill, Elara saw the wild herd in the distance, grazing peacefully near a stand of cottonwoods whose leaves had turned the brilliant yellow of October in Montana. Shadow slowed his pace, but didn't call to them, didn't show any inclination to rejoin their company. Instead, he seemed content to exist in this space between worlds, wild enough to survive on his own, but tame enough to remember what it meant to carry someone he loved. "The accident happened on a Tuesday," Elara found herself saying, the words coming easier now than they had in years. "I was supposed to ride you that weekend. Dad had planned this whole trail ride through the back country, just the three of us. Mum was going to pack her famous sandwiches, and we were going to camp by Mirror Lake like we did when I was little." Shadow's pace slowed even further, and she could feel his attention focused entirely on her voice, the way it had been during those long-ago summer evenings when she would sit in his stall and tell him about her day at school, her dreams for the future, her fears about growing up and leaving the ranch behind. "After the funeral, I couldn't bear to see you in the pasture alone. You kept waiting by the gate every morning, looking for them to come back. Frank Morrison, our neighbor, said you stopped eating for almost a week. He thought you might die of grief." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and Shadow turned his head to look back at her, his dark eyes soft with something that looked remarkably like understanding. The morning continued to unfold around them as they rode deeper into the wilderness, past hidden valleys where elk grazed in the distance, and over ridges that offered glimpses of country so vast and untouched it seemed to exist outside of time itself. Elara felt her body remembering the rhythm of horseback riding, her muscles finding their old flexibility, her balance returning as if she had never been away. "I thought selling you to Frank was the kindest thing I could do," she continued, her words flowing more freely now. "You needed someone who could take care of you properly, and I was barely taking care of myself. I signed the papers and drove away without looking back. I told myself it was better that way, cleaner." Shadow snorted softly, and she could swear there was reproach in the sound. Frank Morrison had called her 6 months after the sale to tell her that Shadow had broken through 4 different fence repairs and disappeared into the mountains. Search parties had looked for weeks, but the horse had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Frank had apologized profusely, offering to replace him, but Elara had felt only a hollow kind of relief. If Shadow was gone, she reasoned, then the last connection to her old life was finally severed. "But you didn't want to be safe, did you?" she asked, leaning forward to stroke his neck. "You wanted to be free. You wanted to choose your own path." As if in response, Shadow suddenly lifted his head and called out, a ringing whinny that echoed across the valley like a song. From the distant meadow, his herd answered, their voices joining his in a chorus that spoke of wild places and unbridled spirits. But still, he made no move to rejoin them. The sun was nearing its zenith when Shadow finally turned toward home, picking his way carefully down the mountain trails with the sure-footed confidence of a horse who knew this country intimately. Elara felt each step in her bones, a gentle jarring that reminded her she was alive, that she was part of something larger than her own carefully contained world of routine and solitude. As her cabin came into view below them, tucked among the pines like a secret, Ilara realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The tight knot of grief that had lived in her chest for 5 years was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a wound and more like a scar, healing but forever changed. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that grief and joy were not opposites but companions, that loving something meant accepting the possibility of losing it, and that sometimes, against all logic and reason, what was lost found its way home. Shadow stopped at the edge of her property, where the maintained trail met the wild country beyond. He turned his head to look at her, and in his eyes she saw a question that didn't need words. He was offering her a choice, she realized. She could slide down from his back, return to her safe, contained life, and remember this morning as a beautiful dream. Or she could choose to believe in impossibilities, to accept that some connections transcend death and distance, and the practical limitations of what should be possible. The choice, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Ilara dismounted carefully, her legs shaking slightly from the unaccustomed exercise, and pressed her palm against Shadow's star one more time. "Come back tomorrow?" she asked, and the horse nickered softly before turning and trotting back toward the high country, toward freedom and the wild herd that had accepted him as one of their own. Ilara stood at her cabin's edge long after Shadow had disappeared into the forest, her hand still tingling from the warmth of his neck, her heart beating with a rhythm she had forgotten existed. The silence that settled around her felt different now, less like isolation and more like anticipation, as if the very air was holding its breath for what might come next. She walked to her porch slowly, her legs still unsteady from the ride, and sank into the wooden chair where she spent most of her evenings reading. The view from her porch had always been beautiful, but today it seemed transformed, invested with new meaning. Every ridge and valley held the possibility that Shadow might appear. Every rustling in the trees might herald his return. For the first time in 5 years, tomorrow felt like something to look forward to, rather than simply endure. Inside the cabin, Ilara moved through her evening routine with unusual care, as if the day's miracle had made every ordinary action sacred. She prepared dinner with attention to flavor she had long since stopped tasting, choosing fresh vegetables from her small garden and cooking with the kind of mindfulness that had been absent from her life since the accident. As she ate, she found herself planning, her mind working in ways it hadn't for years. Tomorrow she would bring carrots, real carrots, not energy bars or whatever substitutes her sparse pantry might offer. She would stop at Morrison's feed store on her way home from work and buy the kind of horse treats Shadow had always loved. The thought of facing Frank Morrison, of explaining why she suddenly needed horse supplies again, should have filled her with anxiety. Instead, she felt only determination. Her dreams that night were different too. Instead of the nightmares that had plagued her sleep for years, visions of twisted metal and flashing lights, and the terrible silence that followed impact, she dreamed of riding through endless meadows under skies so blue they hurt to look at. She dreamed of laughter echoing off mountain walls and the sound of hooves on packed earth, steady as a heartbeat, reliable as sunrise. She woke before her alarm, refreshed in a way that felt foreign after years of exhausted mornings. The October air was crisp and clean as she prepared for work, and she caught herself humming while she made coffee, a tuneless melody that nonetheless felt like music. At the library, her colleagues noticed the change immediately. "You look different today, Ilara," said Margaret Stevens, the head librarian, as they sorted through the morning's returns. "Rested, almost. Happy." Ilara smiled, the expression feeling strange on her face after so much practice at careful neutrality. "I had a good day yesterday, a walk in the mountains. Sometimes nature has a way of putting things in perspective." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. How could she explain that she had been reunited with a horse who should have been dead, that impossible things sometimes happened to people who had given up believing in anything but pain? Margaret would think she was having a breakdown, and perhaps she was, but if madness felt this much like coming alive, then she was willing to embrace it completely. The day passed with unusual swiftness. her tasks at the library taking on new purpose as she helped patrons find stories of their own. A young mother looking for books about grief and healing, an elderly man searching for tales of the American West, a teenager seeking adventure stories that might compete with the allure of video games. Each interaction felt meaningful in a way that routine had long since obscured, as if seeing her own story continuing had reminded her that everyone was living a story worthy of attention. On her lunch break, she drove to Morrison's feed store, a weathered building on the outskirts of town that smelled of grain and leather and the particular sweetness of molasses-based horse treats. Frank Morrison himself was behind the counter, his hair grayer than she remembered, but his smile as warm as ever. "Ilara Mackenzie," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Haven't seen you in here for years. How are you holding up, honey?" "I'm well, Frank. Actually, I was hoping to buy some horse treats. Maybe some carrots, too, if you have them fresh." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Planning to do some riding? There are several good stables around Missoula that offer trail rides." Ilara hesitated, then decided on partial truth. "I've been seeing some wild horses on my property lately. One in particular seems friendly. I thought I might try to gain his trust." "Now, wild horses can be unpredictable," Frank warned, but he was already moving toward the feed section. "Beautiful animals, but they've learned to survive without humans. Best to admire them from a distance." "This one's different," Ilara said quietly. "He seems to remember being around people." Frank paused in his gathering of supplies, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who had known her family for decades. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "Sometimes the best horses are the ones who choose you instead of the other way around. Just be careful, all right? Mountain country can be dangerous for folks who aren't used to it anymore." That evening, Ilara packed her backpack with carrots, peppermints, and a soft brush she had found buried in her closet, a relic from her riding days that she had somehow never thrown away. The brush still smelled faintly of the saddle soap and hoof oil that had been part of her daily routine in the life before, and holding it made her fingers remember skills she thought she had forgotten. She slept better that night than she had in months, and woke before dawn with an energy that felt almost foreign. The pre-sunrise darkness was beginning to give way to grey when she set out for the mountain trail, her breath visible in the cold air, her heart beating with anticipation rather than the dull resignation that had characterized her mornings for so long. The meadow was empty when she arrived, morning mist rising from the grass like spirits departing for some other realm. Ilara settled onto her familiar boulder and waited, watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold, listening to the forest wake around her with its symphony of bird calls and rustling leaves. She didn't have to wait long. The sound of hooves on stone announced his approach, and Shadow appeared over the ridge as if he had been watching for her arrival, timing his own to match hers perfectly. He approached without hesitation this time, walking directly to where she sat, and lowering his head so she could stroke the white star on his forehead. "Good morning, beautiful boy," she whispered, and offered him a carrot from her pack. As he crunched it thoughtfully, she produced the brush and began working it through his mane, removing burrs and tangles with the gentle efficiency of someone whose hands remembered this work in their bones. They spent the morning together in companionable silence, horse and woman rediscovering a language that needed no translation. And when the time came for him to return to his wild family and for her to return to her tame life in town, they parted with the understanding that this was not goodbye, but until tomorrow, a promise that tomorrow would hold space for miracles, for impossible reunions, for love that refused to stay buried, no matter how deep the earth or how final the farewell. As Ilara walked back down the mountain trail, she carried with her something she had thought lost forever. The knowledge that some bonds transcend death itself, that love finds ways to return, even when logic insists it's impossible. and that sometimes, when we stop trying to control our healing and simply allow it to happen, life offers us exactly what we need, in exactly the form we never expected to receive it.